The morning alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m. just like it had every day for the past 3 months. Rosa Martinez rolled out of bed, her body aching from yesterday's double shift at the factory. She moved quietly through the small apartment, trying not to wake her two children who were still sleeping on the makeshift bed in the living room. The broken heater meant the apartment was always cold, and she could see her breath in the early morning air. Rosa had been working at Henderson Manufacturing for almost 2 years now, but the last few months had been different. When her ex-husband stopped sending child support and her second job at the diner closed down, she had no choice but to pick up every extra shift she could get. The factory made car parts, and the work was hard on her hands and back. But she never complained. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She made instant coffee with tap water and ate a piece of bread for breakfast. There wasn't much food left in the cupboard, but she saved what little there was for her kids. 7-year-old Miguel and 5-year-old Sophia would wake up in an hour, and her neighbor Mrs. Chen would come over to watch them before school. Rosa felt guilty leaving them so much, but she had to work these long hours to keep them fed and housed. The bus ride to the factory took 45 minutes. Rosa always sat in the same seat near the back and used the time to rest her eyes. She'd learned to sleep sitting up during these rides. The other passengers were mostly factory workers like her, people who understood what it meant to work hard just to survive. Nobody talked much on the early morning bus. Everyone was too tired. Henderson Manufacturing was a big building on the edge of town. Rosa had to walk through 3 parking lots to get to the employee entrance. She always arrived 15 minutes early, even though she wasn't paid for that time. She'd learned that showing up exactly on time sometimes meant being late if there was traffic or if the bus ran behind schedule. Being late could mean losing her job, and she couldn't take that risk. The factory floor was loud and busy. Machines hummed and workers moved quickly between stations. Rosa's job was to check car parts for defects and pack them into boxes. It required standing for 8 hours straight and using her hands constantly. After 3 months of double shifts, her back hurt all the time and her hands were always sore, but she pushed through the pain. Her supervisor was a man named James Henderson, the owner's son. He was probably in his early 30s, about Rosa's age, but their lives were completely different. He wore clean shirts and had soft hands. He drove a new truck and lived in one of the nice neighborhoods across town. But unlike some bosses Rosa had worked for, James seemed fair. He never yelled at workers or made them feel stupid. He actually paid attention to how hard people worked. Rosa noticed that James had started watching her more often recently. Not in a creepy way, but like he was curious about something. He'd walk by her station and nod hello, sometimes asking how she was doing. Rosa always gave the same answer. Fine, thank you. She didn't want to seem like she was complaining or looking for special treatment. The morning shift was supposed to include a 15-minute break and 30 minutes for lunch. Most workers used their breaks to go outside and smoke cigarettes or sit in the break room. Rosa usually kept working. She needed the money more than she needed the rest. During lunch, she'd find a quiet corner and try to make her small sandwich and apple last the full 30 minutes. Sometimes she'd save half of her lunch for later, when her stomach started growling during the afternoon shift. It was during one of these lunch breaks that Rosa first noticed other workers offering her food. Betty, an older woman who worked at the station next to hers, brought an extra banana one day. My husband packed too much, she said, though Rosa suspected that wasn't true. Then Carlos, who worked in shipping, offered her half of his sandwich. I'm trying to lose weight anyway, he joked, patting his belly. Rosa accepted the food gratefully, but she felt embarrassed. She didn't want people to think she couldn't take care of herself. The double shifts meant staying until 11 p.m. By then, the factory was much quieter. Only about 20 workers stayed for the night shift, and they were all people who really needed the extra money. Some were students paying for college. Others had medical bills or family problems. Rosa fit right in with this group. They all understood each other without having to talk about it. James usually left around 6 p.m. when the day shift ended, but sometimes he stayed later to check on things. Rosa noticed he seemed to pay extra attention to the workers who stayed for doubles. He'd walk around and make sure everyone had what they needed. Sometimes he'd bring coffee from his office for the night crew. Small gestures, but they meant a lot to people who were used to being invisible. One evening, about 3 months into Rosa's double-shift routine, the factory cafeteria closed early because of a broken refrigerator. The workers who brought their own food were fine, but several people, including Rosa, depended on buying their dinner from the cafeteria. Rosa felt her stomach drop. She had exactly $3 in her wallet, and that had to last until payday on Friday. It was only Tuesday. She watched other workers figure out their dinner plans. Some decided to order pizza together. Others talked about stopping at the fast food place down the road. Rosa pretended to be busy organizing her workstation. She hoped no one would notice that she wasn't joining any of the dinner conversations. As the evening shift started and people settled in with their food, Rosa's stomach began to rumble loudly. She tried to ignore it and focus on her work. She'd been hungry before. She could make it through one night without dinner. But by 9 p.m. she felt dizzy when she stood up too quickly. Her hands were shaking slightly as she packed parts into boxes. That's when she made a decision that embarrassed her but felt necessary. She walked over to where James was checking some paperwork at a desk near the factory floor. Her heart was pounding, and her face felt hot. She'd never asked her boss for anything personal before. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson," she said quietly, hoping other workers wouldn't hear. James looked up from his papers, and Rosa could see that he was tired too. Managing a factory was probably stressful, even if he didn't have to worry about money, the way she did. "What can I do for you, Rosa?" he asked. She was surprised he knew her name. With so many workers, she didn't expect the boss to remember everyone. "I was wondering," she started, then stopped. This was so embarrassing. "Since the cafeteria closed early, I was wondering if there might be any extra sandwiches or snacks available. I know it's not your responsibility, but..." She trailed off, not wanting to explain that she couldn't afford to buy dinner. James looked at her for a moment, and Rosa saw something change in his expression. It wasn't pity exactly, but something like concern. "Let me check what we have in the office," he said. "Sometimes people leave food from meetings." He came back 5 minutes later with a wrapped sandwich and a bag of chips. "Turkey and cheese," he said, handing it to her. "And there's a coffee machine in the break room if you want some coffee." "Thank you," Rosa said, feeling both grateful and mortified. "I'll pay you back on Friday." "Don't worry about it," James said. "We've all been there." But as Rosa walked back to her station, she wondered if that was really true. Had James Henderson ever been in a situation where he couldn't afford dinner? Had he ever had to choose between buying food and paying the electric bill? She doubted it, but she appreciated that he was trying to make her feel less embarrassed. As she ate the sandwich, Rosa noticed James walking around the factory floor more than usual. He stopped to talk to different workers, asking how they were doing, if they needed anything. She wondered if her request had made him think about other workers who might be struggling too. Or maybe he was just doing his job as a supervisor. Either way, Rosa was grateful for the food and for a boss who didn't make her feel ashamed for asking for help. The rest of the night shift passed slowly. Rosa's energy improved after eating, but she couldn't stop thinking about how embarrassing the whole situation had been. She promised herself she'd bring food from home tomorrow, even if it meant the kids had a smaller breakfast. She couldn't let herself get caught in that situation again. When 11 p.m. finally came and her shift ended, Rosa gathered her things and headed for the employee exit. As she walked through the parking lot to the bus stop, she saw James getting into his truck. He waved at her, and she waved back. She wondered what he thought about employees like her, people who worked so hard but still struggled to get by. Did he understand how difficult it was, or did he just see them as workers who sometimes needed a little extra help? The bus ride home gave Rosa time to think. She was grateful for her job and for a boss who seemed to care about his workers. But she also felt frustrated with her situation. She worked harder than anyone she knew, but she still couldn't afford basic things like a reliable dinner. Something had to change, but she didn't know what. For now, all she could do was keep working, keep trying, and hope that things would get better eventually. When she finally got home at midnight, Mrs. Chen was asleep on the couch and her children were tucked into their bed in the living room. Rosa paid Mrs. Chen the $20 for babysitting, Money she could barely afford but absolutely needed to spend. After Mrs. Chen left, Rosa looked in on Miguel and Sophia. They were sleeping peacefully, unaware of their mother's struggles. Rosa kissed each of them gently and promised herself that she'd find a way to give them a better life, no matter how hard she had to work to make it happen. The next morning, James arrived at the factory with Rosa's situation still on his mind. He'd gone home to his comfortable house, had dinner with his wife, and watched TV before going to bed. But he kept thinking about Rosa's face when she asked for food. There was something about the way she'd looked embarrassed but desperate at the same time. It reminded him of his own mother years ago, when his father had lost his job and they'd struggled to make ends meet. As James walked through the factory floor during his morning rounds, he found himself paying closer attention to things he'd never really noticed before. He watched Rosa at her station working with the same steady focus she always had. But now he noticed other details. Her work boots were old and worn, with tape around one sole where it had started to come apart. Her jeans were clean but faded, and she wore the same blue sweater she'd worn twice last week. During the morning break, James positioned himself where he could observe the break room without being obvious about it. Most workers bought snacks from the vending machines or had brought something from home. Rosa sat at a table in the corner, drinking water from a plastic bottle she'd refilled at the fountain. She had nothing else. When Betty offered her half a muffin, Rosa accepted it quickly, like she was really hungry. This pattern continued over the next few days. James started keeping mental notes without really meaning to. Rosa wore the same 3 outfits in rotation: the blue sweater with black jeans, a gray t-shirt with the same jeans, and a red blouse that looked like it had been nice once but was now worn thin. Her shoes were always the same beat-up boots. While other workers chatted about weekend plans or complained about bills, Rosa mostly kept quiet and focused on her work. On Wednesday, James decided to test something. He announced that there would be free donuts in the break room to celebrate the factory meeting its monthly production goal. Most workers took 1 or 2 donuts and went back to their stations. Rosa took 1 donut, ate it slowly, and then lingered near the box. When she thought no one was looking, she carefully wrapped a second donut in a napkin and put it in her pocket. James pretended not to see, but it confirmed what he was starting to suspect. The real wake-up call came on Friday morning. James was in his office reviewing the weekly overtime reports when he noticed something unusual. Rosa had signed up for every available overtime shift for the next 2 weeks, including weekends. In fact, looking back through the records, she'd been working double shifts consistently for 3 months, 60 to 70 hours a week after week, without a break. James called Tony, the shift supervisor, into his office. Tony had been working at the factory for 15 years and knew all the employees well. "Tell me about Rosa Martinez," James said. "She's been working a lot of overtime lately." Tony nodded. "Rosa's one of our best workers. Never complains, never calls in sick, always volunteers for extra shifts. She's been here about 2 years now." "Any idea why she's working so much overtime?" James asked. Tony shrugged. "Same reason most people do, I guess, needs the money, though she seems to need it more than most. I've noticed she doesn't spend much money on anything, brings the same lunch every day, doesn't buy sodas or snacks. Real quiet type, keeps to herself mostly." That afternoon, James made an excuse to walk through the factory during lunch break. He watched Rosa sitting alone, eating what looked like a peanut butter sandwich and an apple. The same lunch she'd had yesterday and the day before. Other workers had variety in their meals, but Rosa's lunch never changed. It was probably the cheapest thing she could make at home. When the afternoon shift started, James noticed something else. Rosa worked faster than most people, but she also worked through problems that would normally require asking for help. When her machine started making an unusual noise, she spent 10 minutes figuring out the issue herself rather than calling for maintenance. When she dropped a box of parts, she stayed after her shift ended to recount everything and make sure the inventory was correct. She seemed terrified of doing anything that might reflect poorly on her work performance. The next week brought a new observation that bothered James more than the others. During a staff meeting about upcoming schedule changes, he announced that There would be additional overtime available for anyone interested. Several workers groaned about being tired and having family commitments, but Rosa's face lit up like she'd just won the lottery. She was the first person to volunteer for every single available shift. "Rosa," James said after the meeting, "you've been working a lot of hours lately. Don't you want some time off?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir, I like working. I need the hours. What about your family? Don't you have kids at home?" For a moment, Rosa's composure slipped. Her eyes filled with worry. "My kids understand. They know Mommy has to work hard to take care of them." The way she said it made James's chest tighten. How old were her kids? What did it mean for them to understand that their mother had to work 60 hours a week? James decided to do a little research. He asked Helen in Human Resources to pull Rosa's employee file, claiming he was considering her for a promotion. The file revealed some basic information. Rosa was 29 years old, divorced, listed as the primary guardian of 2 minor children. Her emergency contact was a neighbor, not a family member. Under previous employment, she'd listed 3 different jobs in the past 5 years, including night cleaning and restaurant work. She's never missed a day of work, Helen added. Never been late, never had any disciplinary issues. Model employee, really. That same week, James overheard a conversation that made him understand Rosa's situation even better. 2 workers were talking near the coffee machine about their weekend plans. One mentioned that her husband was taking the kids to see a movie while she worked her Saturday shift. "I don't know how Rosa does it," the other worker said. "Working every weekend, never taking time off. I heard she's got 2 little kids at home." "Yeah, and no husband to help," the first worker replied. "My sister lives in the same apartment complex. Says Rosa's kids are sweet as anything, but they're always asking neighbors if their mom is coming home soon." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He thought about his own childhood, when his father worked long hours at the steel mill. At least his mother had been home with him and his sister. Rosa's children were dealing with something much more difficult. The breaking point came the following Tuesday. James was working late, finishing up some paperwork, when he heard voices from the factory floor. The evening shift was just ending and workers were heading home. He walked out to make sure everything was secure for the night when he heard Rosa talking to Carlos, one of the shipping workers. "Carlos, I hate to ask, but do you have any extra food at home? Maybe some rice or beans? I can pay you back next week when I get paid." Carlos nodded immediately. "Of course, Rosa. I'll bring some tomorrow." "Thank you," Rosa said, and her voice sounded like she might cry. "My kids have been asking for seconds at dinner, and I've been running low on groceries." James ducked back into his office before they could see him, but Rosa's words echoed in his mind. Her kids were asking for seconds at dinner, and there wasn't enough food to give them. She was working 70 hours a week, and her children were still going hungry. That night, James went home to his own family dinner. His wife had made pot roast with vegetables, and there were leftovers that would probably go to waste. His teenage son complained about having to eat vegetables and asked if they could order pizza instead. James looked around his dining room, at the full plates and the comfortable chairs and the warm house, and felt overwhelmed by the contrast. He thought about Rosa going home to hungry children after working a 14-hour day. He thought about her wearing the same 3 outfits and eating the same peanut butter sandwich every day. He thought about her asking co-workers for food and working every available hour just to barely survive. Something had to be done, but James wasn't sure what. He couldn't just give Rosa money without embarrassing her or making other workers feel jealous. He couldn't promote her without justification, and even a small raise wouldn't solve her immediate problems. But he also couldn't keep watching one of his best employees struggle so desperately while he went home to abundance every night. As James lay in bed that night, he made a decision. He was going to figure out exactly how bad Rosa's situation was, and then he was going to find a way to help her without making her feel like a charity case. She deserved better than this, and her children deserved a mother who didn't have to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of what Rosa was dealing with. and that meant paying closer attention to where she went and how she lived when she left the factory each night. Thursday evening arrived with an unusual tension in the air. James had spent the entire day wrestling with his conscience, trying to figure out how to help Rosa without overstepping boundaries or embarrassing her. He'd considered several options throughout the day. Maybe he could create a bonus program for exceptional workers. Maybe he could increase the hourly wage for everyone. But all of these solutions would take time to implement, and Rosa's situation seemed urgent. The day shift had ended hours ago, and James was still at his desk, pretending to work on reports while actually watching the clock. He knew Rosa would be finishing her double shift at 11 p.m., just like she did every night. Most evenings, James left the factory by 6 or 7. But tonight he had made up an excuse about needing to finish some important paperwork. In reality, he couldn't shake the image of Rosa asking Carlos for food, or the sound of her voice when she mentioned her children asking for seconds at dinner. At 10:30, James walked out onto the factory floor. The night shift was much quieter than the day shift. Only about 20 workers remained, and the atmosphere was different. People moved more slowly, talked less. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher against the darkness outside. James could see Rosa at her station, still working, with the same focused intensity she showed during the day. Her movements were mechanical now, automatic after so many hours of the same motions. James positioned himself near the security office where he could observe without being obvious. He watched Rosa pack the last batch of parts into boxes, clean her work area, and gather her things. She always left her station spotless even after a 14-hour day. She put on a thin jacket that looked too small for her and picked up a worn backpack that served as her purse. As Rosa headed toward the employee exit, James felt his heart rate increase. He'd made a decision that afternoon, one that made him uncomfortable but felt necessary. He was going to follow Rosa home. He needed to see where she lived, understand her living situation, and figure out how desperate her circumstances really were. The rational part of his mind told him this was inappropriate, maybe even creepy, but the part of him that remembered his own family's struggles years ago insisted that he needed to know the truth. James waited in his office until he heard Rosa's footsteps fade down the hallway. Then he grabbed his keys and jacket and hurried to his truck. The employee parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars belonging to the night shift workers and the security guards. James could see Rosa walking toward the bus stop at the edge of the property. She moved slowly, like someone whose feet hurt and whose back ached from standing all day. This was his moment of decision. James sat in his truck for a full minute, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel. What he was about to do crossed a line between being a concerned boss and invading someone's privacy. But Rosa's situation had been eating at him for weeks now. He'd tried other ways to help. Small gestures like bringing coffee for the night shift or making sure there was always food available during meetings. But none of it seemed to address the real problem. The bus arrived just as James made his decision. He watched Rosa climb the steps, her movements tired and careful. The bus pulled away from the stop and James followed at a distance. He'd never followed an employee home before. He'd never had a reason to. Most of his workers lived in decent neighborhoods, drove their own cars, had normal problems like car payments and mortgages. Rosa was different, and James was beginning to understand just how different. The bus route took them through the center of town, past the shopping district where James and his family went for dinner sometimes. The bus stopped several times, picking up other late-night workers and a few people who looked like they were heading home from second or third jobs. James stayed back, using other cars as cover. He felt like he was in a movie, except this was real life, and the person he was following was someone who depended on him for her livelihood. After about 20 minutes, the bus turned into a part of town that James rarely visited. The streetlights became fewer and farther apart. Many of the storefronts were empty, with for rent signs and dusty windows. The few businesses that were still open were check-cashing places, dollar stores, and small markets with security bars on their windows. This wasn't the kind of neighborhood where James would expect any of his employees to live, but he was beginning to realize how little he knew about the lives of the people who worked for him. The bus stopped at a corner where two main streets intersected. James watched Rosa get off along with 3 other passengers. She stood at the bus stop for a moment, adjusting her backpack and pulling her thin jacket tighter around herself. The October evening was getting cold, and James noticed that Rosa's jacket didn't look warm enough for the weather. She started walking down a side street that led away from the main road. James parked his truck near a closed gas station and got out to follow on foot. He felt ridiculous, like he was stalking someone, but he'd come this far and needed to see where this led. The side street was darker than the main road, with only every 3rd streetlight working. Some of the houses looked abandoned, while others showed signs of life behind heavy curtains and security doors. Rosa walked for about 3 blocks, past a small park where the playground equipment looked broken and unsafe. She turned onto an even smaller street lined with old apartment buildings. These weren't the nice apartment complexes where young professionals lived. These were the kind of buildings where people lived when they had no other choice. Places with thin walls, broken heating systems, and landlords who didn't care much about maintenance as long as the rent got paid. James stayed back, using parked cars and shadows to avoid being seen. He watched Rosa approach a 3-story brick building that looked like it had been built decades ago and hadn't been updated since. The paint was peeling. Several windows were covered with cardboard or plastic sheets, and the front steps were cracked concrete. A sign near the entrance read, "Sunset Manor Apartments," but there was nothing sunny or dignified about the place. Rosa climbed the exterior stairs to the 2nd floor, her footsteps echoing in the quiet night. James positioned himself across the street, behind a broken streetlight where he could observe without being noticed. He felt terrible about spying on his employee, but he also felt like he was finally going to understand what Rosa's life was really like. The hallway lights on the 2nd floor flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. James watched Rosa walk down the hallway and stop at a door near the end. She fumbled with her keys for a moment, and James could see her shoulders slump with exhaustion. This woman had just finished working 14 hours, and now she was coming home to what looked like a building that should probably be condemned. As Rosa opened her apartment door, James caught a glimpse of the interior. The light inside was dim and yellowish, like it came from a single bulb or maybe just a lamp. He could see part of what looked like a nearly empty living room. There wasn't much furniture visible, just a few pieces that looked like they'd been picked up at yard sales or thrift stores. Then James saw something that made his chest tighten. 2 small figures ran toward the door as soon as Rosa entered. Her children, he realized. A boy who looked about 7, and a girl who appeared to be around 5. They threw themselves into Rosa's arms like they'd been waiting for her all evening, which they probably had. From his position across the street, James couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see the reunion. Rosa knelt down to hug both children at the same time, holding them tightly against herself. The children seemed to be talking excitedly, probably telling her about their day. Rosa nodded and smiled, but even from a distance, James could see how tired she was. What happened next broke James's heart. Rosa reached into her work bag and pulled out something small. It looked like a package of crackers, probably something she'd saved from her lunch. She opened it and divided the contents between her 2 children. They ate the crackers eagerly, like they were still hungry despite it being almost midnight. James realized he was seeing something private and sacred. A mother coming home to children who depended entirely on her, sharing what little she had, even after working the kind of day that would exhaust most people. This wasn't just about money or jobs or company policies. This was about a family barely surviving, held together by a woman who worked harder than anyone should have to work, and still couldn't provide her children with basic security. As James watched Rosa close the apartment door and the lights dim inside, he knew he couldn't pretend he hadn't seen this. He couldn't go back to his comfortable house and his full refrigerator and act like everything was normal. Rosa and her children were living on the edge of disaster, and James was probably the only person in a position to do something meaningful about it. The walk back to his truck felt like the longest 3 blocks of James's life. He sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, trying to process what he'd witnessed. Tomorrow, he would have to face Rosa at work and pretend he didn't know where she lived or how she struggled. But more importantly, he would have to figure out how to help her in a way that preserved her dignity and didn't make her feel like a charity case. As James drove home through the much nicer part of town where he lived, he made a promise to himself and to Rosa, even though she would never know about it. He was going to find a way to change her situation. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he knew he couldn't let a family live like that while he had the power to help. The question wasn't whether he should help anymore. The question was how to help in the right way. James sat in his truck across from Sunset Manor Apartments, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to decide whether to leave or stay. The logical part of his mind told him he'd already crossed enough lines for one night. He'd followed an employee, home, spied on her building, and witnessed a private family moment. But something kept him frozen in place, unable to drive away. Maybe it was the way Rosa had divided those crackers between her children, or the way they had rushed to hug her despite the late hour. Maybe it was the condition of the building itself, which looked like it should have been condemned years ago. Whatever it was, James felt compelled to understand the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. The apartment building stood like a monument to neglect in the flickering streetlight. Paint peeled from the brick walls in long strips, and several windows on the first floor were boarded up with plywood. The front steps had cracks running through them, and weeds grew through the broken concrete. This wasn't just a modest home, or a budget-friendly apartment. This was the kind of place people lived when they had absolutely no other choice. From his position across the street, James could see into some of the apartments through windows that lacked proper curtains or blinds. Most were dark at this hour, but a few showed signs of life. In one first-floor unit, he could see the blue glow of a television. In another, a single lamp cast shadows on nearly empty rooms. The building housed people who were barely getting. Horror, and Rosa was one of them. James checked his phone. It was almost midnight now. Rosa's children should have been asleep hours ago, but they'd been awake waiting for their mother to come home from her 14-hour workday. What kind of life was that for kids who were probably in elementary school? James thought about his own teenage son, who complained if dinner wasn't ready by 7 p.m. and had never had to wonder if there would be enough food on the table. A movement in Rosa's second-floor window caught James's attention. The apartment had one of those cheap blinds with several broken slats, and through the gaps he could see glimpses of the interior. What he saw made his stomach drop. The living room appeared to contain almost no furniture. He could make out what looked like a small couch, probably second-hand, and not much else. The floors looked bare, without any rugs or carpeting. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the broken blind, James began to notice more details that painted a picture of desperate poverty. There were blankets spread on the floor near the couch, arranged like makeshift beds. Rosa's children weren't sleeping in proper bedrooms with their own beds. They were sleeping on the living room floor because there probably wasn't anywhere else for them to sleep. The worst part was what James didn't see. There was no dining room table, no bookshelves, no toys scattered around like you'd expect in a home with young children. The apartment looked more like a shelter than a home, a place where people stayed because they had nowhere else to go, not because they'd chosen to build a life there. James watched Rosa move around the small space, and even from across the street, he could see how exhausted she was. Her movements were slow and careful, like someone whose whole body ached. She knelt down next to her children, who were sitting on the floor bed arrangement. James couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see Rosa listening intently as her son and daughter talked to her. She nodded and touched their faces gently, the kind of tender gestures that showed how much she loved them despite everything else that was wrong in their lives. Then Rosa stood up and walked toward what must have been the kitchen area. James lost sight of her for a moment, but when she reappeared, she was carrying something in her hands. As she passed near the window, James could see it was a small bag, probably from her work lunch. She sat back down with her children and opened the bag, pulling out what looked like an apple and maybe half a sandwich. James realized he was watching Rosa share her own saved lunch with her hungry children. She divided the apple into pieces, giving each child a portion and eating a small piece herself. The sandwich got the same treatment, carefully divided so that everyone got something to eat. But there wasn't enough. There was never enough. The scene reminded James of stories his grandmother used to tell about the Great Depression, when families had to make impossible choices about food and shelter. But this wasn't the 1930s. This was happening right now, in his own town, to one of his own employees. A woman who worked 70 hours a week was still watching her children go hungry. As if the food situation wasn't heartbreaking enough, James noticed something else that made his chest tighten with anger and sadness. The lights in Rosa's apartment flickered intermittently, just like the hallway lights had. But this wasn't just old electrical work. The lights dimmed and brightened in a pattern that James recognized from his own childhood, when his family had struggled to pay bills. The electricity was about to be shut off. James remembered that awful feeling of uncertainty, never knowing if the power would still be on when you came home from school. He remembered his mother rationing their use of lights and appliances, trying to make the monthly payment stretch as far as possible. Rosa's family was living on the edge of having their electricity disconnected, which would mean no heat, no refrigeration, no way to cook food or do homework after dark. Through the broken, blind, James could see Rosa getting her children ready for bed. She helped them arrange the blankets on the floor, creating a little nest where they could sleep together. There were no separate bedrooms, no privacy, no space for anyone to be alone. The entire family lived in what appeared to be a single room, maybe with a tiny bathroom and kitchen area that James couldn't see from his angle. But what struck James most was how normal Rosa tried to make everything seem for her children. Even though they were sleeping on the floor of a rundown apartment, even though they'd just shared half an apple for a late-night snack, even though their mother had to work 14 hours a day just to keep a roof over their heads, Rosa was tucking them in with the same care and attention that any loving parent would show. She sat with them for several minutes, probably reading a story or just talking quietly. James could see her stroking her daughter's hair and adjusting her son's blanket. These were the moments that mattered to children, the bedtime rituals that made them feel safe and loved. Rosa was giving her kids that security even when she couldn't give them proper beds or regular meals. After the children settled down to sleep, Rosa moved around the apartment doing what looked like evening chores. James watched her fold clothes, probably preparing things for the next day. She moved between the kitchen area and the living room, and James got glimpses of how sparse everything was. The refrigerator, when Rosa opened it briefly, appeared to be nearly empty. Just a few items on the shelves, nothing like the full refrigerator James took for granted at home. Rosa sat down on the small couch and pulled out what looked like bills or papers from her work bag. Even in the dim, flickering light, she was trying to manage her finances, probably figuring out which bills she could pay and which ones would have to wait. James had seen that look before, on his own mother's face during the worst times. It was the expression of someone doing impossible math, trying to make $10 stretch to cover $30 worth of needs. The most heartbreaking moment came when James saw Rosa put her head in her hands for just a few seconds. It was the first time all evening that she'd allowed herself to show how overwhelmed she was. During those brief moments, her shoulders shook slightly, and James realized she might be crying. But then she straightened up, wiped her face, and went back to looking at her papers. She couldn't afford to break down even in private. Her children needed her to be strong. James looked at his watch. It was almost 1 a.m. now. Rosa had been home for about an hour, but instead of sleeping after her exhausting day, she was still taking care of her family and trying to manage their desperate situation. When would she sleep? How many hours of rest would she get before starting another double shift in a few hours? As the lights in Rosa's apartment finally went out, James realized he was looking at something that would change his perspective forever. This wasn't just about one employee having financial problems. This was about a system where someone could work harder than almost anyone else and still not earn enough to provide basic security for their children. Rosa was doing everything right, working every available hour, never complaining, never asking for special treatment. And yet she was failing through no fault of her own. James started his truck and began the drive back to his own neighborhood, but his mind stayed fixed on what he'd witnessed. The contrast between Rosa's life and his own was almost unbearable to think about. While he went home to a heated house, a full refrigerator, and comfortable beds, Rosa's children were sleeping on the floor and wondering if there would be breakfast in the morning. By the time James reached his own driveway, he'd made a decision that would affect the rest of his life and Rosa's. He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what he'd seen. He couldn't go act to work tomorrow and act like everything was normal, while knowing that one of his best employees was struggling in ways that no one should have to struggle. The question wasn't whether he should help anymore. The question was how to help in a way that would actually make a difference, not just for Rosa, but for her children who deserved a chance at a better life. As James walked into his warm, comfortable house, he promised himself that Rosa's story wouldn't end the way it was. Tomorrow he would start figuring out how to change everything for a family that had already endured far more than anyone should have to endure. James barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rosa's children sleeping on blankets, on the floor, or Rosa dividing her saved lunch between them, or the empty refrigerator in their dim apartment. He kept thinking about the contrast between his own son's comfortable bedroom and the makeshift sleeping area he'd witnessed. By 4 a.m., he gave up trying to sleep and went to his kitchen to make coffee. Sitting at his dining room table, surrounded by the comfort of his middle-class home, James started making notes on a pad of paper. He'd spent most of the night thinking about how to help Rosa without embarrassing her or making her feel like a charity case. Direct handouts would be insulting to someone as proud as Rosa. A sudden promotion might seem suspicious to other workers. But there had to be a way to make a real difference in her life. James thought about his own company and what resources were available. Henderson Manufacturing had been profitable for several years, but most of the money went back into equipment, facility improvements, and standard employee benefits. There wasn't a formal program for helping workers in crisis, but maybe there could be. Maybe Rosa's situation was an opportunity to create something that would help not just her, but other employees who might be struggling silently. By the time James arrived at work that morning, he had the beginnings of a plan. But first he wanted to observe Rosa with fresh eyes, knowing what he now knew about her home life. When he walked through the factory floor during the morning shift, he saw her at her station with the same focused determination as always. But now he noticed things he'd missed before. The way she moved a little slower today, probably because she'd only gotten a few hours of sleep. The way she kept glancing at the clock, probably calculating how many hours until her next paycheck. During the morning break, James positioned himself where he could watch the break room. Rosa sat in her usual corner spot, drinking water and eating what looked like a single piece of toast. Other workers chatted about weekend plans or complained about minor problems. Rosa sat quietly, probably saving her energy for the long day ahead. James wondered what it felt like to be surrounded by people who worried about things like car payments and vacation plans when you were worried about keeping the electricity on. Around noon, James called a meeting with his management team. He included Tony, the shift supervisor, Helen from Human Resources, and David, the company accountant. James had spent the morning refining his ideas, and now he was ready to present them as business decisions rather than charity. "I've been thinking about employee retention and productivity," James began. "We've had some good workers leave for other jobs recently, and I want to make sure we're competitive." The team nodded. Employee turnover was always a concern in manufacturing. "I'm proposing several new programs," James continued. "First, I want to start providing free meals for employees working double shifts. Research shows that proper nutrition improves productivity and reduces workplace accidents." Helen looked interested. "That makes sense. A lot of our double shift workers are eating vending machine food or skipping meals entirely." "Exactly," James said. "Second, I want to establish an employee assistance fund. We'll contribute a percentage of our quarterly profits to help employees who face financial emergencies. Things like medical bills, car repairs, housing issues, all handled confidentially through HR." David, the accountant, pulled out his calculator. "What kind of budget are we talking about?" James had done his homework. I'm thinking we start with $50,000 for the meal program and another $50,000 for the assistance fund. We can evaluate and adjust after 6 months. The numbers were significant but not devastating to the company's budget. More importantly, they represented real help for people who needed it most. There's one more thing, James added. I want to create a housing assistance program. Partner with local apartment complexes and landlords to provide temporary housing for employees in crisis situations. Sometimes people just need a safe, stable place to get back on their feet. Tony nodded, slowly. I can think of a few workers who might benefit from something like that. Over the next 2 hours, the team worked out details. The meal program would start immediately, with the factory cafeteria staying open during all shifts and providing free meals for anyone working more than 10 hours in a day. The assistance fund would be managed by Helen, with applications processed confidentially and quickly. The housing program would take longer to establish, but James made it clear this was a priority. I want to announce these programs at the end of the week, James said. Frame it as an investment in our workforce and a way to stay competitive with other manufacturers in the region. That afternoon, James walked through the factory with a different feeling than he'd had in weeks. Instead of feeling helpless about Rosa's situation, he felt like he was finally doing something meaningful. The programs would help Rosa, but they'd also help other workers who might be struggling in ways he didn't even know about. When Friday arrived, James called an all-hands meeting at the end of the day shift. Workers from both shifts gathered in the large break room, curious about what their boss had to announce. Rosa stood near the back with several other double-shift workers, looking tired but attentive. I want to talk about some changes we're making. Here at Henderson Manufacturing, James began. Over the past few months, I've been thinking about how to make this a better place to work, not just in terms of wages and benefits, but in terms of supporting each other as a community. He could see people paying attention now. Company meetings were usually about production targets or safety reminders, not about community. Starting Monday, we're launching 3 new programs, James continued. First, anyone working a double shift will receive free breakfast and lunch from our cafeteria. We've expanded our kitchen staff and menu to make sure there are healthy, filling options available. Several workers looked surprised and pleased. James glanced at Rosa and saw her eyes widen slightly. Second, we're establishing the Henderson Employee Assistance Fund. This will provide financial help for employees facing unexpected emergencies, medical bills, car repairs, housing issues, family crises. The application process is completely confidential, handled through HR, and decisions are made quickly. Now James had everyone's attention. He could see people calculating what this might mean for their own situations. Finally, we're creating a housing assistance program. We've partnered with several apartment complexes and landlords in town to provide temporary housing for employees who need a safe, stable place while they get back on their feet. James paused and looked around the room. These aren't charity programs. They're investments in our workforce. Research shows that employees who aren't worried about basic needs are more productive, have fewer accidents, and stay with companies longer. This is good business. The room erupted in applause and excited conversations. Workers were turning to each other, discussing what these programs might mean for their families. James watched Rosa, who had tears in her eyes but was trying to hide them. Applications for the Assistance Fund and Housing Program are available from Helen starting Monday morning, James concluded. The meal program starts immediately. Anyone working more than 10 hours today can get dinner from the cafeteria before you leave. After the meeting ended, James watched workers approach Helen with questions. Rosa hung back, probably not wanting to seem too eager or desperate, but James could see her talking quietly with Betty, who was encouraging her to apply for help. Over the next few weeks, the programs began making a real difference. The cafeteria served dozens of free meals every day to double-shift workers. Helen processed applications for the assistance fund, helping employees with everything from car repairs to medical bills to overdue rent. The housing program took longer to get running, but James was determined to make it work. Rosa was among the first employees to receive help from the assistance fund. Helen handled her application with complete discretion, But James knew when the check had been processed because he saw Rosa's demeanor change. She still worked hard, still took every available overtime shift, but there was something different about her. She seemed less desperate, less afraid. A month later, Rosa approached James during a shift change. "Mr. Henderson, I wanted to thank you for the new programs. They've made a real difference for a lot of people." "I'm glad to hear that," James replied. "How are things going for you?" Rosa smiled, and it was the first genuine, relaxed smile James had seen from her. "Better. Much better. My kids are excited because we're moving to a new apartment next week. It has real bedrooms and everything.